Hello and welcome back. Let us try to understand the concept of clustering, and we are going to cover k-means and dbScan, two algorithms in scikit-learn. And before we jump in and do coding, we need to understand the concept, right? So let us try to understand what is k-means clustering and how it works. In k-means clustering, k is the number of clusters in a data set. So the clustering is an unsupervised technique. We have seen dimensionality reduction, one unsupervised technique, and this is another unsupervised technique. So in k-means, basically clustering means grouping records. And when I say unsupervised, there is no target variable to measure the error and try to adjust the weights and things like that. So the k-means clustering algorithm or dbScan algorithm will use the input features and try to group records into clusters. If I say this data is divided into three clusters, that means three groups. These data points belong to one group, these data points belong to another group, these data points belong to another group. When I say data point, a record, when I say record, there will be x1, x2. This is a two-dimensional one, so there are two features, x1 and x2. But if it is n-dimensional, right, there will be x1, x2 and so on, and xn number of features. So coming down to the k-means clustering, as a data scientist, we need to specify the k, how many clusters the data should be divided into, how many groups the data set should be formed into. So how to decide that k? We have measures to that, and we have metrics to decide that. We'll come to that in a later point in time. But suppose that for this data set I have chosen 3 as the k is equal to 3 I chosen, or I wanted to divide this data into 3 clusters. Immediately the k-means clustering algorithm will choose 3 random data points as cluster centroids, and then it tries to measure the distance between the centroid and all the other data points in the data set. So it takes this data point, a random data point, and measures the distances between this data point and all the other data points. Again, it takes the second cluster centroid and measures the distance between all the data points, third centroid, and measures the distance between all data points. Now it will assign the first cluster ID to the data points which are close to the first centroid, randomly chosen first centroid, and assigns the second cluster ID to the data point which are close to the second centroid, and assigns the cluster ID 3 to the data points which are close to the third centroid. The next step is going to be, it will actually calculate the average of all the data points which are belonging to for cluster 1. In the first step, it randomly chose one data point as centroid and then measure the distance and came to a conclusion that this many number of data points, these data points belong to cluster 1. So it will take average of all these data points and say that as the centroid. Similarly, it is going to take average of all these data points and say that as the centroid. Similarly, it is going to take average of all these data points and say that as the centroid. That means the centroid is moving. We are learning the centroid, right? The centroid will move. So like that, in the second slide, like that it will move. It moved a little bit. Now again, it will actually measure the distance between the first cluster centroid and all the other data points, second cluster centroid, all the other data points, and third cluster centroid, all the other data points. Here the distance measure metric may be Euclidean distance. Okay. Again, it will reassign the cluster numbers to the data points. Now the centroid moved a little bit after taking the mean of the data points. Centroid moved a little bit, right? So the cluster assignments also will change for the data points. So it will measure the distances and reassign the cluster IDs. So it actually, this data point came into this cluster. If you look at that, this data point was there in the second cluster. After taking the average and moving the cluster centroid and measuring the distances, it found that this data point belongs to first cluster. See that? It moved to first cluster. Again, it will actually take the average of the data points in the first cluster, average of the data points in the second cluster, average of the data points in the third cluster, and it moves the centroid to another place. If you see that, the centroid is moving, right? Centroid moved, right? So centroid moved. Again, it is going to calculate the mean of distances between this centroid and all the data points, this centroid and all the data points, this centroid all the data points, and reassign the cluster ID. So if you look at this, in this particular setup, in the second iteration, we have these 4 data points belonging to second cluster, but if you see this, these 4 data points came into first cluster because these data points are close to the first cluster centroid after calculating mean. Similarly, here also you can see some change, right? These 2 data points actually belong to cluster 2, but when after reassigning or calculating the mean of the data points and then reassigning the cluster centroid, measuring the distances, it actually reassigned the cluster ID to these two data points as 3. So that's how the algorithm works, and it does the iteration, calculating mean, measuring the distance, reassigning the cluster centroids, again calculating mean, measuring the distance, again reassigning the centroid. That happens until the centroids are not moving anymore. So that is the k-means clustering algorithm. So when I say a centroid is calculated or mean is calculated, if you have n number of features in your data, when you calculate mean also you will get n number of features only. If you have, in this theory I have written as p. If you have p number of parameters, when you calculate, it's a vector, right? Each row is a vector, and you have around 20 or maybe 30 rows in this first cluster. When you take a mean, you will get 1 row. So this is again going to be another data point. When you say the cluster centroid is a vector, okay? So let us try to look at the theory, right? Try to read it out and see. So select k, that is in this algorithm, in this particular process we have chosen 3 as the cluster, 3 centroid, 3 clusters. Select k cluster centroids from the data. These serve as initial cluster assignments for observations. Initially it's going to randomly choose 3 data points, and then what it does is for each k clusters compute the cluster centroid, right? It actually tries to measure the distances and reassign the centroid and calculate the, for each of the k clusters compute the cluster centroid. That means it calculates the mean. The kth cluster centroid is the vector of p features, and assign each observation to the cluster whose centroid is closest. So it's going to measure the distance, calculate the distance between data points and centroid using measures such as Euclidean distance, and then it reassigns. This happens, iterate until cluster centroid assignment stops changing. If you look at this, right, here the centroids are somewhere here. It moved, they moved, right? Along with the centroids, the data points assignment is also moving, right? Assignment is also changing. Beyond this, right, it was not changing anymore. So that's where I actually kept only 3 slides there. So that is about k-means clustering. In the coming session, we will understand now how to choose k and what are the error metrics to look at, whether the the centroids got assigned properly or not, or clusters got assigned properly or not. Thank you.